A veteran was enjoying his lunch when bullies attacked, but one stranger's courage turned the day around. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply stood between disrespect and dignity and changed everything. This is a true story. Before we dive in, where are you listening from right now? What's your story? Drop it in the comments. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the wind rustled dry leaves along the sidewalks and golden sunlight stretched gently across the benches. Thomas Lee sat alone beneath a maple tree at Central Park in Fairhaven, Ohio, the same spot he'd visited nearly every day that year. He laid out his simple lunch on the bench beside him, a ham sandwich, a thermos of black coffee, and a small plastic container of coleslaw. He wore an old ball cap that had faded in the sun. The words Gulf War veteran stitched across the front were still clear, just worn at the corners, like the man himself. He was 62, lean and quiet, with gray stubble along his jaw and deep-set eyes that rarely met another's. Thomas didn't come here for conversation. He came for the quiet. It helped keep the noise inside his head from getting too loud. The wind carried the scent of fall through the air, earth, wood smoke, and dry grass. Children's laughter rang from the playground in the distance, and the faint sound of a jogger's feet tapped steadily along the path behind him. He took a slow sip of coffee and watched a squirrel dart across the grass. There was peace in these small things, predictable things, until it changed. Three boys, teenagers, wandered into the park from the street. They laughed too loud, voices cracking between bravado and youth. Their hoodies hung loose, sneakers scuffing the pavement as they made their way toward the center benches. At first, Thomas didn't pay them much mind. Kids passed through all the time, but something in their tone made his shoulders tense sharp, mocking. "Yo, check out the hat," one of them said, not quietly. Another snorted. "What's it say, Gulf War, that was, like, 100 years ago?" The third boy didn't laugh. He just looked at Thomas with a smirk, then whispered something that made the other two burst out laughing. Thomas lowered his eyes to his sandwich. He took a bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, like if he ignored them long enough, they'd disappear. But they didn't. "Hey, old man," the first boy called out. "You still think you're a hero or something?" Thomas didn't look up, didn't flinch. The second boy stepped a little closer. "You know nobody cares about that war, right? You're just sitting here like some leftover." Thomas set his sandwich down. His hand was trembling slightly. Barely visible, but it was there. The third boy picked up an empty soda can from the ground. He tossed it underhand, and it bounced near Thomas's foot with a soft metallic clang. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it was meant to humiliate. They laughed, loud and hollow, the kind of laughter that stripped dignity. Thomas didn't say a word. He reached for his thermos with careful fingers, but his hand missed slightly. The coffee tipped, dribbling across the bench. His breathing slowed. The sound of the boys' voices faded, and something else rose in its place. A memory. Hot sun, burning sand, the distant whump of artillery. Then came the radio static in his ears, the yelling, the smell of diesel fuel and smoke. He saw Corporal Jenkins, his face pale under a red-streaked bandage, trying to crawl back toward cover. Thomas blinked hard, and just like that, he was back. The wind shifted. The park returned, and so did the laughter. Thomas exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't get up, didn't shout, but something behind his eyes had changed, like a man bracing himself for a storm he knew too well. "Let's go," one of the boys said, nudging the others. He's not going to say anything anyway, but the damage was already done. Not by the can, not even by the words. It was the reminder that after all these years, after surviving a war most had already forgotten, he could still be made to feel small, right here at home. A pigeon fluttered nearby. A dog barked across the lawn. Life moved on, but Thomas just sat there, hands resting on his knees, the hat still on his head. If you looked closely, you'd see it, not anger, Not fear, just a quiet kind of sorrow, the kind that never quite leaves a soldier. And in that moment, he thought no one saw, no one cared, but someone did. Someone had stopped just outside the circle of shade, watching the scene unfold silent, still, and he was about to change everything. Michael Carter had seen enough. From his spot near the walking path, he'd watched the whole thing, the laughter, the can, the silence. He wasn't dressed like much, just jeans, work boots, and a gray hoodie. But there was something in the way he carried himself, spine straight, eyes sharp, like a man who didn't miss details. He worked down at Sal's auto shop on Maple Street, just a mile from the park. He came here on his lunch break sometimes, same as today. At first, he thought about letting it go. Not his business, not his problem. But when he saw the old man's hands tremble, and then saw his eyes drift off like that, he froze. Michael knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror before, and he couldn't walk away from it. Without a word, he started toward the bench. His boots crunched leaves with quiet rhythm. The boys were still laughing until they noticed him. He didn't shout, didn't puff his chest. He just stopped a few feet away and looked them square in the face. "You boys know who that is." His voice was steady, low and cold. The tallest one rolled his eyes. "Just some old guy in a vet hat." Michael didn't blink. "He's more than that." He took a step closer. That man wore that uniform when half the world was on fire. He stood in 120-degree heat, in gear that would suffocate most of you. He dragged wounded men out of burning vehicles in the desert. He let the silence hang there. The boys stopped smirking. Michael's tone never rose. If you lived one day in his boots, you wouldn't laugh. You'd thank him. And maybe, just maybe, you'd sit down and listen. One of the boys shuffled backward. Another looked down at his shoes. They didn't say a word. "Go on," Michael said quietly. And just like that, they turned and walked off, quick, awkward steps. The cockiness drained out of them. Michael didn't watch them leave. He turned back to the bench. Thomas was still there, still quiet, still holding his coffee like it was something fragile. Michael didn't ask if he was okay, didn't offer cliches or questions. He just sat down on the far end of the bench, a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Only the wind spoke, brushing leaves along the grass, carrying the echoes of the park back into calm. Then Michael said, softly, "I wore the uniform too. Name's Michael. Marines." He extended a hand. Thomas turned his head slightly, and for the first time that day, he looked someone in the eye. He shook Michael's hand. His grip was firm, but slow. "Thomas. Army." Michael nodded once, like a silent salute. Neither man smiled, but something in the air had shifted, a small weight lifted. They sat like that for a while. Two men who didn't need many words. One trying to remember who he used to be, one who never forgot. The pigeons returned to the bench across from them. A kid zipped by on a scooter. Life, again, moved on. But this time, Thomas didn't feel invisible. Not anymore. Michael glanced at his watch, then looked at Thomas. "You eaten yet?" he asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not really." "Come on," Michael said, standing. "There's a diner 2 blocks down. Best meatloaf in town." He didn't wait for a yes, just started walking slow enough that Thomas could follow if he chose to. A few moments later, the old soldier stood, gathered his lunch back into the bag, and walked beside the man who didn't ask questions, just made space. The diner was quiet that time of day. Checkered floor tiles, cracked vinyl booths, the smell of coffee and fried onions hanging in the air. They took a corner booth, away from the windows. Thomas ordered grilled cheese. Michael got the meatloaf. Neither of them mentioned the boys at the park. Instead, between sips of sweet tea and the clink of silverware, Thomas spoke. Not all at once, just pieces. He talked about the desert. Not the combat, that part stayed locked away. but the silence after. The way home didn't feel like home anymore. After the war, he worked security at a freight yard for nearly 20 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him purpose. Then COVID hit, and the company downsized. He was let go with a 2-week notice and a firm handshake. Since then, things had gotten quieter. Too quiet. I don't go out much, Thomas admitted, eyes on his plate. Some days, it's easier not to try. People look at you like you're part of some old movie they don't want to watch. Michael nodded. He understood more than he let on. I help out with a group, he said, called Warrior Bridge. We do job training, peer support, housing help, just connection. Really? He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out his phone. You mind if I make a call? Thomas looked up, puzzled, then shrugged. Michael dialed. 2 rings. Then a cheerful voice answered on speaker. Warrior Bridge. This is Emily. Hey, Em. It's Mike. I've got someone here I think you ought to meet. He glanced at Thomas. He's Army. Desert Storm. Emily didn't miss a beat. Sir, thank you for your service. Would you be open to a short chat? Thomas blinked. The voice on the other end was warm. Genuine. Not scripted. He leaned in. Yeah, I think I would. That was the first phone call Thomas had taken in months that didn't involve bills or robocalls. And it was the first time in years someone called just to listen. While they spoke, Michael looked out the diner window. He didn't say a word. Just let the conversation happen. A small step, maybe, but for men like Thomas, it meant everything. Later that evening, long after the lunch rush had faded, something else happened. Someone had been filming in the park. A bystander probably just recording to share with friends. They posted the clip online that night, titled it, Stranger Defends Veteran from Bullies at Park. It started small, a few dozen views, then 100, then 1,000. By the third day, the video had over 1 million views. It spread across veteran forums, Facebook pages, even local news. People shared it with captions like, "This is how you honor our heroes, and we need more men like him." Thomas didn't know. Not at first. He didn't use social media, barely touched his phone unless it rang. But on the 4th day, Michael showed up at the park again. Same bench, same time. He slid into the seat beside Thomas and handed him the phone. Thought you should see this, he said. Thomas watched the clip, watched himself sitting there still, silent. Watched the boys throw the can. Watched Michael walk into frame, calm and firm. He watched the comments scroll underneath. Hundreds of strangers saying thank you, calling him a hero. His hands tightened around the phone. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, but they shimmered. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he handed the phone back. I didn't think anyone noticed, he said softly. Michael gave him a look. People notice, he said. They just forget how to speak up. And Thomas nodded, slow, heavy, like a man beginning to believe it. 1 week later, Thomas stood just outside a low brick building with a weathered sign that read, Veterans Peer Support, Warrior Bridge. He held the doorknob for a long second, fingers stiff, heart unsure. Then he stepped inside. The room smelled like coffee and old carpet. Voices drifted in from a circle of folding chairs near the back. Laughter. A few coughs. Nothing threatening. A woman with kind eyes greeted him by name. Glad you made it, she said. Come on in. We're just getting started. Thomas nodded and walked in slow but steady. He sat near the edge of the circle, hands folded tight. The men and women around him wore plain clothes, different ages. But there was something familiar in their eyes, like they'd all come from the same storm. At first, Thomas said nothing. He just listened. Stories of service, of struggle, of survival. When the meeting ended, people started getting up, stretching, chatting quietly. Thomas stayed seated until a man in his 40s with a prosthetic arm leaned over. Fallujah, 2004, the man said, offering a fist bump. Respect, Thomas replied softly, meeting the gesture. They talked for nearly an hour. Nothing dramatic, just memories, aches, and dark humor only vets would understand. And in that easy rhythm, something unlocked. By the time Thomas walked out of that building, the October wind didn't bite so hard. He didn't feel so invisible anymore. And when Michael called him that night to ask how it went, he said just 2 words, "I'll be back." A month passed. Thomas didn't just come back. He stayed, week after week, sitting in that circle, nodding along, sometimes speaking, sometimes just being there. Eventually, someone asked him to help greet the newcomers, then lead check-ins, then offer his story to the new guys who didn't know how to start theirs. He never claimed to have the answers, but he had presence. And in that room, presence meant everything. The video, it kept growing. 3 million views by Thanksgiving. Veterans across the country commented, "Happened to me too. Thanks for standing up. Reminds me of my dad." A small-town paper ran a piece titled, "A Quiet Hero at the Park." Someone printed the article and pinned it up at the support center. Thomas never mentioned it, but he'd sometimes pause to glance at it on his way in. He and Michael still met every Thursday. Same park, same bench. Only now, it wasn't just two of them. One afternoon, Michael brought coffee and donuts for everyone. 3 guys from the support group showed up, then a few more. They didn't plan it, but that bench became something more than just a place to sit. They shared meals, talked life, laughed loud. And Thomas. He looked different now. Same hat, same quiet eyes, but his shoulders no longer slouched the way they used to. His voice carried more weight. On one of those afternoons, a little boy came skipping down the path, probably 5 or 6. He slowed as he passed their bench. Looked at the older man with the veteran's cap. He didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. He just raised his small hand and gave a sharp, proud salute. Thomas paused, then smiled warm, deep, and full. He returned the salute, not out of habit, but out of hope. Because sometimes dignity isn't in medals or headlines. It's in being seen, in being heard, in knowing that after all you've given, there's still a place for you at the table. And on that bench, under the autumn sun, surrounded by people who understood, Thomas Lee sat tall. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a forgotten soldier. He felt like a man who came home.